Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Daniel Smith. I'm President and CEO of Cooperative Network. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you back for the afternoon session. And first, welcome to all of you who are just joining us for the first time today. We had an excellent morning session going over governance issues that cooperatives are facing. This afternoon, we'll be centering on GM and CEO evaluations. So I'll turn it over to Chris and we'll jump right into the subject matter. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks, Dan. And good afternoon, everyone. I'm Chris Kopka. I'm one of the co-founders of the Center for Agricultural Cooperative Director Development. And I am thrilled to have with me today two relatively recently retired CEOs, Brad Hewitt, who through 2018 ran the team at Thrivent Financial, and then also took a role right after that as the interim CEO at the Wilder Foundation, and Gail Graham, who retired. Do I have the date correct, Gail? Wasn't it like in early 2020, right around the hit of COVID, that you retired from Mississippi Market?
Friday, March 13th, 2 days after the pandemic was declared.
Yeah.
But I kept working. I've just retired as GM.
Yeah. And I'd say that's true of both Brad and you, Gail, that you've both kept working, but you have this remarkable experience and backgrounds as chief executive officers for two of the incredibly well-known member-owned, member-governed institutions in the upper Midwest. In Brad's case, Thrivent, and in your case, Gail, Mississippi Market. Before we dive into our topic for today, which is CEO evaluation, maybe I'll hand it first to you, Gail, to share a little bit more of some of your background and experience, and then invite Brad to share a little bit more about his background and experience.
Sure. As Chris said, I just retired as general manager of Mississippi Market. We're a 3-store member-owned cooperative, national food cooperative in St. Paul, with these days about 205 employees and about 32 million in sales. I was GM there for 20 years, and before that I was GM at a couple of other Twin Cities food co-ops. I've also served on a variety of boards of directors, from nonprofits, foundations, and for 14 years for United Natural Foods, which is the wholesaler for the natural products industry. I'll turn it over to Brad.
Thank you. And it's actually really nice to meet you, Gail. Like I said, shopped at your co-ops a lot. So yeah, I was the CEO of Thrivent, as Chris said, and it's about a 2.2 million member co-op. And just before that, I had served as a denominational executive with the Lutheran Church, which actually runs like a giant co-op too. It's really interesting. And I was, in essence, like what you would call the GM there, although their corporate governance structure is really different. I was kind of the head of all the business operations there. So, so really, for about the last 25 years, have spent time in what I would describe as cooperative businesses. Before that, I was more in the corporate world with a global pharma company and a healthcare company, and started off my career in the actuarial department of a life insurance company. So, kind of an eclectic background, but have become a real believer in cooperative mutual governance as a powerful, valuable way we can solve a lot of societal issues. So, and really looking forward to participating today.
Well, thank you both. Just for everybody who's in the audience, a couple of things. One, I have a set of prepared questions that I'm going to walk through with Brad and Gail. That said, if you have your own individual questions, go ahead and post them in the chat. We have several moderators who are going to be assisting here and who can ping me and Brad and Gail if questions come up from the audience. And then two, we're going to take a certain amount of the programming time for the interview portion of me posing questions to Brad and Gail. At the tail end of today's presentation, you're also welcome to go into one of the break rooms where we'll have the opportunity for peer-to-peer interaction. Again, so if you have questions other than mine, pose them in the chat room, and Courtney or Mike Boland or one of the other moderators will send them over our way. So Brad and Gail, let's dive in. Here's our first question. It's sort of an opener. from your own past experiences, what are your thoughts on why every board should perform and provide at least an annual CEO or general manager evaluation? And Brad, for this first question, why don't we start with you and then go to Gail, and we'll toggle back and forth.
Yeah, and that, clearly I believe we should at least do an annual, but my personal belief in the way we structured our governance is virtually every board meeting was a performance review, but on a different topic. So we'd go dive deep into that topic. One on mission, vision, values, corporate culture. The next one more on strategy and future planning. Another one on talent, and where they do kind of what I would call more the traditional CEO evaluation of talent. And then what I would describe as the operations deep dive into operations, finance, margin of the business, et cetera, how we doing on market share. So really from my experience, it was a quarterly performance review in order to dive deep enough into all the topics that need to be covered.
Yeah, thanks, Brad. And Gail, what's a little bit that you've learned from your past experience?
Well, it's interesting because Mississippi Market operates with policy governance. Some of you might be familiar with it, but at the risk of leaving those behind who aren't, essentially it's a governance structure system where the board sets ends policies, which are mission related, and then limitations policies, which provide guidelines for how they want the mission accomplished. And the basis of it is that we meet practically monthly. So on a regular basis, the general manager is providing monitoring reports. A big one is against the ends policies, the mission, and then in other months against the limitations policies. So asset protection, treatment of staff, treatment of consumers. And at those meetings, there's a robust report with an opportunity for the board to dive in to evaluate if they agree with my interpretation of what that policy means, and then if they agree with the data that I'm presenting to support that interpretation. So technically, in a pure policy governance organization, you don't even do a review because it's happening all of the time. We still have always conducted annual reviews, and for me, I think that process, in addition to the monthly reporting, is it just really sets aside a structured time for the board to really give kind of a holistic thought to how the general manager is doing, and for the board chair and the GM to sit down and reflect on the year, celebrate successes, and come up with some written goals for the next year. So I think that time of reflection is valuable.
Thanks. And actually, what's great about your answers, there's several great things about your answers, but Brad and Gail are in some respects telegraphing how the three of us have set up this conversation, because we're, just for the audience's awareness, we're next going to dive into preparation. What happens before the evaluation actually happens? And then what's happening in the context of the evaluation itself? What are some steps that the CEO or the board might be taking after the evaluation, as Gail just mentioned? And then since 2020 was such a special year, we'll also spend a little bit of time on like, how different do we treat 2020 or do we not? Let's go to our next question. And it's this, and one of the advantages of having you both participate is that you have both the C-suite experience and the board experience. So right now, let's envision where it's our board. The board is starting to think about the performance evaluation process. What should the board be doing? What should the board be undertaking in anticipation of the upcoming performance evaluation? And again, Gail, if you don't mind, this time let's start with you, and then we'll hand the mic over to Brad.
Sure. So like I said, we're always policy governance light, so we don't do it as a dogma. And we do have an annual review process. For us, we've documented that process so that we can repeat it. And that's been important. So part of it is just leading up to it is to make sure that the board chair is putting the time into reviewing the process and scheduling things out so that they're getting things on the board calendar, that there's enough time allowed in executive session for the board to have robust conversations. They set a deadline for me to provide a self-review, and that's really the basis of their jumping off point really for what they're going to be thinking about, I think, in the review process. They might ask for special information depending on what an issue of the year might be, and they would ask that from me, and then I might have to get it from one of my direct reports. And I think also throughout the year, we certainly would hope that there's not going to be surprises in a review process, just like you would hope there wouldn't be with your direct reports. So my board has always had a practice of having regular executive sessions, first with the GM and then with me leading, to allow time for them to discuss amongst themselves if there's any issues that come up. And then ideally there wouldn't be any surprises because things would have been addressed along the way. That's about it.
Thanks, Gail. Let's hand the mic to you, Brad.
Sure. Again, given my first answer, the way you do the prep for each of those 4 different sessions is different. So if you're trying to get a sense of corporate culture and vision and things, what we would tend to do is more of a cultural assessment beyond just me telling, the board it's great or it's not great or whatever. And likewise with a talent piece, we would spend time, whether it was my personal review on how well I was doing or the next level of talent as we prepared for transitions. So the answer is the preparation, I think, is as important as the actual review, so that you can get really good data and a way to think about the issue. Because for most board members, and you show up once a quarter, you're there for a or less or more, depending on the size of the organization. And it's really hard without the preparation for a board member to really contribute. And what I found frustrating, both as a board member and as a leader, is if you had a board member who was critical without data, it was frustrating kind of for everyone. And so the preparation was really important. And frankly, I think that of all the things that you do, getting the board ready to do it well is critical for the evaluation to be valuable.
Sure. Thanks for that, Brad. Well, Matt, Gail touched on this and you both touched on this, is that there's a little bit of a dance between what is the preparation that the board is doing and then what's the preparation that the CEO or the GM is doing. So let's have you maybe shift the hat a little bit now, and you've got your former CEO hat or your former GM hat on. What's the preparation you're doing in advance and in the dance with the board coming into the evaluation? And again, this time, Brad, let's start with you, and then we'll switch back to Gail.
And again, I think this is one of those processes where working closely, and it's one of the ones I appreciated, having a non-executive chair, working, and Gail said the same thing, working with the chair really was a valuable part of my own preparation. And again, so the rhythm that we had was our February meeting was really about the results, the really short-term results and the really long-term vision and mission. And so the prep for that was really the annual accounting, the annual goals that we had, and did we do those well or not? And then preparing to the board at least two weeks ahead of time with that data so that they could read it and really think about it was really important in my preparation. The strategy session, it tended to be a lot different than that one, where it was, how are we doing relative to, our market share goals within our co-op and the margins that we were trying to accomplish and all of that, and what strategy changes or what new strategy did we need. And so the prep for that was really different. Again, from my standpoint, is it was really trying to help the board understand the strategy choices, and my role in helping was to whether those were clear and easy to understand and the choices were factual and et cetera. The talent piece, it was we tried to do every other year a full 360 with 2 levels down in the organization for the talent part, about both me and my direct reports for the board, so that they could get a sense of that. And that's a pretty standard process of 360 and feedback. So you can kind of, and then on the operations side and on how efficient we were and what technologies we needed and all that kind of stuff, we tended to honestly, that was the one that we didn't do as well. And I think my prep was, it was hard to keep it out of management, and yet they needed to understand it. And so the issue with the board was they wanted to then jump into management because a lot of operations is management stuff. But that was a trickier one. And I could say from my personal experience, I didn't do that one particularly well.
Thanks for that, Brad. Gail, how about you?
Well, similarly, a lot of the prep work is, it's preparing reports throughout the course of the year. We also would do, every other year, we do an external employee survey, and the board would get they would get different metrics from it, but they would actually get a certain section of it where it was my direct reports completing the survey. They would get that information compiled. And in the past, we've periodically done some just internal 360s as well, because the board wants to get a sense of what are the people who report to the GM think about how it's going, to get a sense of that. Our cycle's a little different. Our fiscal year ends at the end of June. We're getting our audit usually completed in August. And so we're doing the GM review in the September, October timeframe before we move on to a new governance year, essentially. For me, I'll often just start by taking a look at review, just really reviewing.
Just checking to see if you all can hear me. I've lost Gail a little bit.
Oh, sorry, I'll move a little closer. Maybe I'm too far from my mic. Can you hear me now? So I'll really just review our mission and our strategic priorities, take a look at the goals from last year, really spend time thinking about events of the year and how they impact the results of the year. We certainly look at different operational data, and it might vary depending on what pops up as most important in the year. If we've had a couple of years where maybe we've had safety issues, that could be a metric that we're paying more attention to, where we're getting more information. So it really is a little bit of that. And then I think in an organization of our size, there's a certain amount of just nudging the board along that I end up doing too, to make sure that they're staying on track with their timeline and their process. I don't see Chris.
Yeah, I think we lost Chris. I want to tell you one kind of war story that I think would be valuable. And this is when I worked at the denomination, which really operates like a co-op. We had separate businesses for different parts, whether it's publishing or finance, loan, lending, et cetera. And one of them was the pension plan. And because I was the kind of the GM over all of it, but they each had their own boards. One of the people that was on one of those boards, he was a master at actually keeping the board, and he really believed in policy governance, but he took it to an extreme. And so the board never got to talk to anybody but him. And the chair of the board came to me one time and said, I just don't feel right about this. And I said, look, the easiest way is just do a 360 and do it, so that you can hear from the people right below. Because I knew it was a problem too. And honestly, they got, when they did that 360, they got like 6 and 7 pages of comments from each individual person that worked for that person. And the way that the system worked is that they had to renew the person's contract every 5 years. And he was only like 2 or 3 months away from being renewed, and they let him go before the 5 months. It was that bad. And so, part of it is the board owns some of the prep too, and not just trusting the general manager or the CEO. And as a CEO, giving the board comfort that they can find ways to get direct feedback was really important.
Yeah, I think that's one of the traps of policy governance, is when it's viewed as a dogma. It's almost, it's people have very strict rules, and technically, yes, they don't, I am the main conduit with the board, but we also have regular, we'll have marketing do presentations. We'll have the HR guy there when we're reviewing the talent and staff. Right. So we're always bringing other senior leaders in as well. And we would historically have an annual retreat that senior leaders would be a part of too. Yep. And when I was on a corporate board, there was a lot of interaction with the senior leadership team, because it's important to get a perspective other than one completely filtered through the eyes of the GM.
Yep, that's right. Hey, welcome back, Chris. We just
Yeah,
took over.
thanks. I figured between you both and Mike and Dan and Don and Kristen, somebody would pick up, and thank you for doing that. I think I know where we are in the flow. Thank you for ad-libbing a little bit. And if you feel like we've already covered this in the 30 seconds I was dropped off, I apologize. But one of the questions that I wanted to pose to you both, it's to set the context of what are some of the key focus areas that a board is going to commonly consider. And you've already noted a few in the earlier answers. I'd lift up that you've talked about the culture of the cooperative itself, the talent strategy, the general strategy, and policy. And Brad, you had briefly alluded to as well to performance metrics, whether they're financial or operational. Before we move into some of the other aspects of evaluation, let me pause here and see if there are other commonly occurring focus areas that you've experienced either or both as a board member or as the CEO GM that other cooperatives should anticipate coming up in a review. And I've lost my place on who gets to go first this time. So Gail, why don't I start with you and we'll hand it to Brad and we'll see where we go from there.
Sure. One thing that's come up both when I was on a corporate board and I think in my board, if I think back years ago, is just how does the board feel about the timing and completeness of the information that they're receiving from management. One of the things, we used to get huge board decks, and there was just a lot of pushback. At one year in particular, I remember, like, the board just really worked with the CEO to insist that we started getting things in a more timely manner because there was so much information to review. So I think the concept of how well we're supporting our boards is a legitimate one that could come up in the course of a review process also.
Yeah, I completely agree with that one. And the other one that I've experienced, both as a chair of a board and as a CEO, general manager, in almost every context I've been, and it doesn't show up, unfortunately, in most reviews. And to me, it's one of the biggest issues that most boards wrestle with is the pace of change. How fast change should happen, and I think that creates so much tension in a lot of boards, and I kind of always figured I had it right when, half of the board was telling me we're going too slow and half were telling me we're going too fast. I figured that was about right, but I don't think it was ever really a very valuable metric for either me as a GM or for the board. And it's part of the strategy, and it almost always gets lost, in my opinion, in the evaluation and how do we evaluate the pace of change.
That's fantastic. I want to note again for the audience, particularly if you joined a little bit later, Brad and Gail, this is their first time meeting with one another, and so far they've been in radical agreement with one another. I'm curious to see if we find an area of intense disagreement. Doubtful, but possible. And I'm going to just let everybody know. So I'm in rural Colorado. As I'm presenting with or moderating for Brad and Gail today, I'm in less rural Colorado, but one of the challenges that some of our board and co-op members on the line will have experienced is when the internet drops. So I'm just going to give a quick heads up to Mike Boland and to Courtney Berner that I am sending them the PDF via email right now of the questions that Brad, Gail, and I prepared. So if my internet drops off again, one or both of them can jump in quite ably to walk through the rest of the questions. All right, our next question up is, and it goes a little bit to what Brad was talking about around culture. And as we were preparing the governance materials for the Center for Agricultural Cooperative Directors, we found a debate about whether or not cooperative uniqueness, if you will, should be considered in and as part of the CEO's or the GM's evaluation. And I'm curious how you both feel about that. Should cooperative uniqueness feature in some way? If so, how? And if it shouldn't, or if there are challenges to it, what are some of the reasons it maybe shouldn't be brought up, or it should be addressed with care? And I think for this one, let's start with you, Brad, and then we'll hand it over to Gail.
Yeah, when you brought this up, my first reaction was no, And the more I thought about it, it was probably maybe. And the way I thought about it was, clearly any co-op, any organization is paying attention to some degree to market share, which is what your uniqueness is all about. And so paying attention to, are we serving our target membership well in a constructive way is a kind of a part of uniqueness. And clearly your uniqueness flavors into your corporate culture. So it feels like it's part of a whole bunch of things in my mind. So I'm still at the maybe, but it's probably moved from no to maybe yes. And I think for me, that's an area of it's worth spending some time thinking about and planning and organizing that in a way that would add value to accomplishing the mission. But I think the answer is yes.
Thanks for that. We've moved from no to maybe to yes in the span of preparation for this. That's fantastic. Gail, where are you at today?
Well, I'm a firm yes. And for us, part of it is it would come up in the annual monitoring process along the way. So it would be one of the monitoring reports that I would present to the board, would include information about our cooperative identity and our cooperative uniqueness. And I think that it's reasonable that that be part of what the board consider. As Brad said, it is partly just that we're member-owned organizations. We need to be responsive to our member owners. We do periodic external surveys of member owners, and so we need to, we incorporate that information into what the board looks at too. Are members satisfied with how we're delivering service, with how we're aligned with their values? And I think also as a co-op, we need to consider how we're cooperating with other co-ops. It's the 6 principles. So, there's always in some report somewhere I'm going to be mentioning, what organizations we're a part of, what co-ops and maybe industry organizations my team is sitting on, because I think contributing in that way is important as well. So I don't think we ever would look at hiding behind cooperative uniqueness as an excuse for poor performance. I just think it's part of our performance, and we can report on it.
That, Gail, that last point is the point that where I started with no, because a lot of my experience with talent and others is it was that hiding behind, the co-op uniqueness to have it as an excuse for not growing, not getting the margins, not getting the production that you'd want. But in your answer, I think you're spot on. I think that's why it's a yes. The no is the danger.
Well, and I think in today's world too, if you look at what's been happening just, really in business in general, corporations more and more are accepting the need for them to demonstrate corporate social responsibility beyond just a commitment to philanthropy, because that's what the consumers want. Millennials are more and more value driven, and studies have indicated that they're willing to change brands based on the values being espoused by the companies. And so I do think that in general, this is being looked at in some way by leaders.
We've got a couple questions coming in the chat, one publicly and one privately. And the private one goes in some respects to CEO selection. It's not exactly on evaluation, but that's obviously on a continuum of senior management talent. So let me pose that one first. And let's just get your perspective on this, even though it's a little bit off topic. But it's on the topic of co-ops and culture. And here's the question: can co-op culture and knowledge be taught to a new CEO, or should that CEO bring it with them? It's the external candidate, internal candidate in some respects is at the heart of the question. And I think on this one, are we going to Brad first this time and then to Gail?
Sure.
All right, Brad, you get the hot seat.
I'm happy to go either position. I honestly, the answer to that question is I do think to some degree that's part of an evaluative process of whether somebody understands the cooperative model and mission, and because I found that to be frankly a bigger challenge with board members who come from a corporate setting than people who are interested in being in a co-op and running and leading and being part of a co-op. But I do think that's a great question, because I think that can derail or at least delay a co-op if you don't pay attention to that.
Thanks, Brad. Gail, what's your perspective on that?
You're on mute.
Yep, just unmuted. I do think that you have to hire for a cultural fit. And I do think that you can train, and educate people about the cooperative difference, and that you can, create converts to the cooperative way of thinking. But I do think the cultural fit piece is important. I don't think an inside candidate, just because they have co-op background, is going to give them the edge that's necessary to be the right person to take on the job.
And just a quick reminder for everybody. Thanks, Brad and Gail. Just a quick reminder for everybody. We are going to keep time at the tail end for breakouts. And Mike Bolin was doing a quick tally. It looks like we have at least 7 CEOs or GMs who are on the call right now. We've got several board chairs and board members. So if you have a different or an additional perspective on Brad and Gail's take on this or anything, stick around. We'll have time for peer-to-peer discussion too. Let me go to our next question, and this is sort of an open-ended question, and it might then, this is our next chat question, but it might filter into back into some of the evaluation questions. Looking high level, are there best practices that either or both of you see when you're communicating as CEO to the board? And it's an open-ended question, so you could come at that broadly or frame it back narrowly in the context of performance and evaluation. And for this one, Gail, why don't I hand it to you first? And that's courtesy of Dorothy, by the way. Thank you for sending in that question. So Gail, let's get your perspective and then we'll hand it to Brad.
So, for when I think of the review process, I think that the council is to have a practice and have it documented and follow it. It's just, and I know I've had in some early years at the co-op, I had different boards where one year they would say, well, we decided we're going to do it this year, this way this year. And it was just completely kind of off-putting and would keep things unbalanced, and timing would go down the tube. So to just really know how you're going to approach a review process is important, because then people can prepare for it adequately. And to make sure that you're allowing sufficient time, because the board does need to be able to have the opportunity to discuss what they think and to come to agreement, so that they really can speak with one voice about how they think things are going. And I just think knowing that, scheduling the time with the GM, it's important to do that. And just really knowing that it's never easy for boards to do this. No one likes to tackle this process, and it's not going to get any easier if you put it off. So stop procrastinating, calendar it, and get it done. Turn it over to Brad.
Thanks, Gail. Yeah, I agree. And the two things in terms of like best practices around communicating that I found was having a regular rhythm, so that the board knew what was coming and knew what to expect. And so that was kind of helping to get them knowing what topic was next and how to be a good board member. But frankly, the other best practice that I found around communicating was that for our staff, and Chris heard this all the time from me, the board wants to know what time it is, not how you built the watch. And every staff member wants to tell them how the watch was made, how the gears work and all of the detail. And frankly, pushing back and really getting the staff reports to what time is it instead of how the watch works was a really critical best practice. And frankly, that helped the performance review, because that let the board have what Gail was just talking about, the time to talk about the really important things instead of getting sucked into management questions that weren't helpful.
Yeah, thanks both. All right, so speaking of getting it on the calendar and speaking of communications, we're moving from preparation for the evaluation and the dance between the board and the CEO or the GM. And now the evaluation is actually happening. as Brad and Gail both know, one of the reasons for this question is, as we were doing research for the agricultural cooperative governance materials, most of what we heard from CEOs was that the evaluation process was at least okay. But we heard a couple horror stories where either the evaluation wasn't happening at all, or it was so cursory as to feel like it hadn't happened. So Gail and Brad, the evaluation is on the calendar. Some form of communication and conversation is going to happen. From your past experiences, what are some of the ways that the board can effectively approach and perform the evaluation with the CEO or the GM? And I think, Brad, we'll start off with you this time, and then we'll hand it to Gail.
So my experience, and I don't know if this is good, bad, or indifferent, my experience when it's been best, either as me as board chair or me as a GM CEO, it's always been best when it's been the board chair and maybe the head of governance, if they're not the same thing, a couple board members sitting down and doing it directly, and then having a bigger discussion with the board, rather than trying to have the board all do it together all at one time. Because it just, the ones that felt cursory to me is when we tried to do it in a big group instead of with 2 or 3 people. And so that's just my experience. And frankly, you know, a good, as a chair and or as a CEO, having a good chair, that felt like a really valuable time for honest conversation about where to improve. And the chair had gotten feedback from board members to have that conversation. Gail?
Thanks, Brad. Gail, what's your perspective? Yeah, thanks.
Very similar. I think in my co-op, it's been more the board chair would meet with me one-on-one. And so I think setting aside a good, you know, at least an hour for that meeting, and maybe we take a little longer, maybe we take a little less, but coming prepared, having already had that robust discussion with the board and their draft thoughts, ideally in writing, about the review and what it looks like. And then in the course of the conversation that we might have, they might make some, you know, minor tweaks to their report or whatever. But to really have that one-on-one, usually as part of that conversation, we're also taking a look at goals for the upcoming year, at least in a draft form. And then the board chair would bring that back to the full board to review it in executive session, get it signed off on, and then so we could actually get it completed. But to make sure that that conversation has, you know, people are prepared for it and that there's time for it is really important. And then sometimes, again, because it's a smaller organization, there has been at least a year or two where things just sort of unravel after that meeting. And it's this like, all right, you know, has the board had a chance to look at this shit? When are we going to get something to HR? To make sure that you come to closure, get it done, get those goals in writing so that everyone knows what to be thinking about.
So you both mentioned a little bit about time in one way or the other, and I'm not trying to suggest that time equals quality, but just putting a finer point on it, is there an amount of time in a review that you feel would be too short, measured, say, in minutes? And on the flip side, is there an amount of time that you might feel be like, this could be way too long, probably measured in hours or days? So what feels about right to give enough time for consideration in the context of performance? Gail, let's start with you, because you specifically use the word time.
Well, you know, I think for the review meeting itself, you know, a minimum of an hour with some flexibility so that it can go longer when it needs to. I sat on governance committees when I was with UNFI, but I never was a lead where I was meeting with the CEO in the review process. And so I think it was probably similar there, where at least a few hours were reserved to really dig into the review process itself.
Yeah, I concur. I think, again, from my experience, an hour with the board chair after you've gotten feedback, or he or she had gotten feedback, and then my experience was to then include, like I'm the board chair of Habitat for Humanity International, and then we have a time with the executive committee, which is all the different committees, and then we have a shortened time with the board, just so that everybody feels like they have some part of it. But each of those got to be a smaller number, you know. So it was an hour plus kind of one-on-one, it was probably 45 minutes or 30 to 45 minutes with the executive committee. And it was probably about that same, 30 minutes or less with the whole board, just in an executive session, just so that they could have input and time, and if they wanted to say something. So the minutes, if you add them all up, it ended up being a couple hours, but it was more heavily weighted towards the one-on-one.
Thanks, both. What's your perspective on whether or not a board should be engaging a third party in some way as part of the evaluation process? And if, let's assume for a second, if a board does engage a third party, are there any guidelines or bumper posts or best practices you'd have boards consider for how to leverage a third party in a CEO or GM evaluation? And Brad, let's start with you on that one.
So I'll just disclose my bias right now. I am biased against consultants, and I am biased towards experts. And so I'm not a fan of consultants, but I love experts. And so I think when you're in that process, sometimes if you're going to do a 360 and do interviews with staff, having somebody who's an expert trained in that is a good thing to do. So my personal view is looking for, in those different parts of what I had kind of said were our review processes, my experience was is there are experts in each of those that are worth thinking about. I don't think it's easy to have a general consultant do any kind of the performance review. I think that takes away from the board's role.
Thanks, Brad. Gail, what's your perspective with this?
My bias is also against using consultants in general, but especially for something like this. But I think when I started giving it thought, it's like, well, I guess we do use a consultant when we're doing a staff survey. It's somebody outside the organization. They're preparing the information, the 360 part for the board. But it's really been a more limited role. It's to provide information. When I was with UNFI, we did use an accounting firm that actually managed the process of the review, but theirs was really sort of a mechanical role. So they were getting surveys out to the board members, getting them back in, compiling them, providing that information to the governance committee. So it was really a support role. They didn't really have anything to do with actually conducting the evaluation process.
Yeah, so what I'm inferring, and I'm teaching back, is look for expertise in the area. It should be a secondary role, and it shouldn't supplant from an actual board member being the or two, depending upon the process, but it should be the board or a member of the board who delivers the actual evaluation. That's your perspective. That there may be different perspectives from other co-ops, and again, I'd encourage peers to bring that into the breakout rooms, and because this is a really important topic. We want our CEOs and GMs to be evaluated. We want our boards to be engaged, and we want our strategies to be executed well so the co-op sector grows. All right, so we've had we've prepared, we've had the evaluation. Now we have a little bit on follow-up. What happens if the CEO or the GM has a little bit of a disagreement? The board has this perspective, and you think they're reading the tea leaves the wrong way. Are there any suggestions you'd have for how a CEO or GM can engage constructively with the board following the evaluation, particularly if there's an area of disagreement? And Gail, why don't we start with you on this one, and then we'll hand it to Brad.
Okay, well, it's similar to how I would approach it if I had that kind of disagreement with one of my reports. I mean, really, it's a matter of being able to probe a little bit, ask clarifying questions, ask if the board chair can help you understand what led the board to this conclusion, and then present your own perspective and disagree respectfully, about this is what information leads you to your conclusion. So it's some of that back and forth. Ultimately, the board is the boss. But I think for me, most of the disagreements they've been more related to some of the goals sometimes, where there's been more back and forth and pushing on some of those. But really it's having a discourse.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add with that other than maybe a story I had a board member who didn't agree with the whole board, but felt very compelled to give me feedback when he didn't agree with the board or me. And I would have to periodically remind him that, his job was to convince at least 7 of the 13 board members that he was right. And until he did that, we couldn't, even though he didn't like or agreed, that wasn't kind of my problem, and so I think that's one of those things with when you have multiple bosses in a board, recognizing that not always will the board agree, and so trying to navigate that situation can become tricky.
Thanks for that. That's really helpful. Okay, so now we've completed the evaluation, and Gail, you alluded to this a couple answers ago. So things coming out of the evaluation are going to feed into what? One of the things you mentioned is, coming into the evaluation, it's also a good time to start thinking through drafts of goals going into the next year, et cetera. Are there thoughts that either or both of you have on like, okay, well, we have this crisp and valuable information. Let's also leverage it for this. And Brad, let's start with you on that question, and then we'll hand it over to Gail.
Yeah, Gail said it before, and I think it's exactly right. For me, part of the value of an evaluation is to set goals, to set those things, and the practical reality is the CEO has to, for all practical purposes, needs to be the person who's accountable to actually help the board, put the next steps in, do that. And I do think that can be a place where it's easy to just let it slide but yeah, my sense of it is if you've done a good job in the evaluation of getting the goals, they do become the foundation of so much of what's going to happen for the rest of the year. It's hard for it not to just filter into what's going on in the whole organization.
Thanks, Brad. Gail, anything you'd build off of that?
Not really much to add. I think Brad is right. And I do think, some years I've had board chairs who will be purposeful about checking in quarterly to say, well, how are we doing on these different things? Sometimes I've had more explicitly time-dependent goals, and the board chair will put it on the board agenda. Let's talk about how this is going. You need any more support. And sometimes it's just, I'll have my list of goals taped to the back of my tablet, keep it in mind, and it'll come up the next time I'm reviewed. It doesn't mean it's not impacting the work that happens, but it's not as brought up as much, perhaps, depending on the board.
Thanks, Gail. Interestingly, we have a kind of a flip side of a question from a couple questions back. All right, so this is coming in from David Thorben, and if I'm pronouncing your last name incorrectly, I apologize, David, but should and how does a board deal with a CEO or GM who works directly against the direction of the board? Gail, let's start with you on that one, and then we'll hand it over to Brad. And this is the upside, everybody, of having CEOs who have also been, they've been in both hot seats, the fiduciary hot seat and the management hot seat.
Pretty much, I can remember I had 3 different CEOs during the time that I was with UNFI. And that exact case came up at one point in time. And that person literally, I don't think it took more than 2 months, and they were no longer CEO. A severance agreement was arranged and they were out. The perspective was either you fully support your CEO and you know that they're doing what they need to do, or you fire them. It doesn't mean you don't push back. It doesn't mean there's not conversations that can be difficult, but you can't have a situation where the CEO isn't doing what the board needs them to do. When there's a conflict that's explicit, there's no really room at the table for that person, I don't think.
I agree completely, Gail. And in fact, if as a CEO, if you don't agree with the direction of the board, I think it's your obligation to try to fix it. And if you can't fix it, it's to leave.
Thanks both. And David, I hope that answers the question. All right, so we've mostly been talking today in the context of potentially any year. 2020 was observedly a fairly different year than most other years, even though every single year has its challenges. So this is our wild card question for Brad and for Gail. Should a board take any special consideration about some of the macro context from 2020? If so, how? And potentially, if not, why not? And Brad, why don't we start with you on this one and we'll hand it to Gail.
I've always believed goals are there for basic direction, but management discretion is always the best. Board discretion, management discretion is always the best. And I don't know how you could possibly look at 2020 and not have a lot of discretion. And I'll tell you what we're doing on where I'm on 3 boards now, and in every single case, we've basically thrown out all of the goals that we set last year to be accomplished, and said, how well have we done at navigating the pandemic? How well are we prepared for once the pandemic is over, et cetera? And none of those were on our radar. None of those were the goals that we had agreed to, and it doesn't matter. And we've tried to do the best we can to figure out how to do the performance reviews in that kind of a context.
Thanks, Brad. Gail, what's your sense about how a board should be approaching 2020?
Well, I agree with Brad. A crisis eventually passes, but what lingers is how people feel about how their leadership reacted and about how they were treated. Were they kept informed? Were their opinions sought? Were relationships damaged, or was loyalty enhanced? And a lot of that comes up in how we react to what's in front of us. So it was a very different year, and there were, like Brad said, you had to focus on the pandemic, and that's what you had to focus on. It didn't make any difference what the goals were for the year. So that really was the key, is like, this is what's in front of us. How have we done?
Thanks both. Let me highlight one potential question that I know Mike Boland has received from at least one ag co-op board. And it's the question of non-recurring and fairly odd public policy-based revenues. So if our co-op has received PPP loans, we met all the requirements, those loans were forgiven, it's essentially a form of non-recurring revenue. Do you think that should be factored in if you're in the board? Do you think that's fair play? Do you think it's foul play? And then maybe the flip side of that question would be 2020 will have also brought up a whole bunch of hopefully non-recurring expenses. So this is sort of diving a little bit deeper into some of the strangeness of 2020 and how it might impact the income statements of some of our co-ops. Do you have any initial thoughts on how boards might approach that? Not necessarily that they should take your opinion, but more like, how might you frame it? How might you approach it philosophically? And Gail, why don't we start with you on this one, and then we'll hand it to Brad.
Yeah, I think I would approach it as a publicly traded company would when they had a one-off event, when they divested themselves of an underperforming asset, when they had to write something down, or when they did an acquisition and they had, expenses that came up, but it wasn't accretive to revenues yet. So to me, it is a one-off, and it should be considered. It doesn't change the ultimate results for the year, but the board should at least be able to say, well, if it wasn't for this, it would have looked like this. And just to be able to take that into consideration is completely reasonable to me.
I agree with that. And I would add the what we've been trying to do, and where I've been in every single case, we have that exact both revenue and expense that seem to be one time. Part of the way as a board we've been trying to sort it out is how well are we getting ready for once the pandemic is over? Because to me, that's the really important question. It's the looking forward, and that's the job of the CEO. So yeah, they have to pay attention to the finances, but are we going to be ready in the future to do what we need to do? And that on the boards that I'm on, that's the key question.
Thanks, Brad. I also know that in both of your careers, you've been advocates for diversity, equity, and inclusion throughout. And I don't want to leave this call without, in addition to the pandemic, we saw questions of social policy and justice raised in 2020 that have certainly been raised in the United States in the past, but they brought up, they had particular poignance in 2020. And I wanted to pose to you both as well, how might that feature for a board and for a CEO reflecting on the past year, and how might that figure in future strategic discussions and culture discussions? And Brad, why don't we start with you on that one, and then we'll hand it to Gail.
You know, this has been something that I've paid a lot of attention to as a CEO, and my point of view as a CEO is the data is super clear. Diversity increases performance as long as it's creative and not destructive. And the challenge is to both get diversity and to know that diversity is going to cause conflict, and to make that conflict creative and constructive. My observation in the last year is that we have focused on the diversity, equity, inclusion, and not the how to take that creative conflict and make it positive. So to me, the focus is, yes, you have to work on diversity, equity, inclusion, but that's not enough. You have to work on how to make the conflict that's going to come creative and constructive. So I think we've underestimated the creative, constructive piece and overestimated the DE&I.
Thanks, Brad. And Gail?
You know, I think diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice have been important to our co-op for a long time. The last store that we opened in 2015 was in Dayton's Bluff, which is the most diverse community in St. Paul. And we've had goals related to DEI issues in my annual goals really every year, whether it be just like increase the diversity of the staff, what does it come from to, or, you know, develop a plan specific to improving our efforts. And I do think it's reasonable for the board to be looking at this. Our world is changing. Our communities have changed dramatically and are going to continue to. And to be successful, we have to be able to change with them, to be reflective of them, to be incorporating other perspectives. So I do think it's really important. This year was particularly challenging because we're pretty much at the epicenter of the issues that came up over the civil unrest after the death of George Floyd. And so we really were making extra efforts to make sure that we were communicating both with our community, our members, and our staff. You know, it added a whole nother level of stress, you know, and happened in late May, you know, as we're still just trying to settle in from the pandemic. It was a very difficult year. So we've really tried to recognize that and still maintain our commitment to making progress on these issues.
Thanks, Gail. Now for our audience, I want to give everybody a 3-minute warning at, well, it'll probably end up being 1:31 since it's a 3-minute warning. Dawn is going to break our audience into breakout rooms, and we have a variety of moderators who are standing by to help. I believe this is a first for Cooperative Network to figure out how to leverage Zoom and to go into semi-organized break rooms. So if we have a little bit of technical difficulties, give a little bit of grace to Dawn and Kristen and Daniel, but hopefully it goes out without a hitch. So why am I giving you the 3-minute warning? If I'm about to pose the last question to each of Brad and Gail. If you do not wish to participate in the peer-to-peer breakouts, go ahead and sign off after that. And if you do, bring additional questions, bring your perspective into the breakouts, and we're going to have an opportunity for peers to learn from other peers. So my last question, and with that, I'm going to give my last question to Gail and Brad. And they both know me well enough to know that my last question is sort of a funny question. As you reflect on as our own prep for this, and as you think through some of your thoughts and answers, is anything occurring to either of you as sort of what's the question we didn't ask, but maybe also bring up as a last thought or a closing thought to help our board members and our senior management team members who are on this call prepare for this upcoming evaluation season, whether it's calendar end or, as Gail mentioned, it might be organized on a fiscal year basis. And so closing thoughts, closing questions, closing tips. Let's start with Brad and we'll close with Gail.
Nothing really specific other than my personal view of performance reviews for every organization I've ever been in for virtually everything is really around, mission, market share, and margin. That those three things are important to every, and I think it's especially true of co-ops, is paying attention to those three things and keeping them in creative tension. And finding ways to measure each of those in a constructive way.
Thanks, Brad. Gail.
Well, and I'll go to the soft side of it. I completely agree with what Brad said. And I think it's incumbent upon us as the leaders to really make sure that we're working on the culture with our board as well, that we're always aware of the need to have a culture of respect, candor, and trust, so that we're providing the board with the information that they need to be able to understand what's happening in our world, especially when it's so unsettled and topsy-turvy as it has been this year. And we need to have the ability to respectfully disagree, to be able to handle when people do push back. Dissent is okay, disloyalty isn't, and it's good to have different voices in the room. So we want to have a culture where that's the norm, where we can get people to speak up.
Thanks so much, Gail. Daniel Smith, if you are online and able to come off mute, let me just check and see if you're still online. It looks like you might be.
Yes, I am.
All right, before we go to breakouts, first, can I have everybody come off mute briefly and give a round of applause to Gail and Brad for taking the time to be with us today. And they did a lot of prep in the background for this. So thank you both. And Daniel, if you're game, I'll hand it to you for closing thoughts. And well, let me first do a quick reminder. Mike Bolin, thank you for the private note. So for everybody, FYI, once we move into breakouts, we're going to stay in breakouts until the 2 o'clock Central Time hour. And at that point, the program will come to a close. We're not going to come back and regroup here. So some of you might sign off after Daniel's closing thoughts, and some of you might sign off at the close of the breakouts. But just FYI, we won't come back into the big room. With that, Daniel, let me hand it to you, and then you in turn get to hand it to Don. How's that, sir?
Sounds good. Thank you, Chris. Thank you to all of our presenters today. We've had a wonderful couple hours of conversation. That's very, very important as we all navigate the new ways of doing cooperative business, whether it's governance or evaluations or just conducting our work as cooperatives. At Cooperative Network, we are committed and dedicated to us all working together. It's very, very important in the changing economic, social, and cultural environments that we're all working in, that cooperatives stay together, that they have a voice in both the halls of government and in the public square. And we are very proud to work with all of you, to work with Dr. Bolin and Chris on these. And we look forward to continuing our e-learning series, our webinar series, until we can all get together again, which we look forward to very much. So please reach out to Cooperative Network at any time for any issues that you are encountering, any things that we should be aware of that we can help you with, getting your word to the governors or the state legislatures, and in the public square as well. So thank you for being with us today. We will now go to our breakout sessions, and we look forward to seeing you quickly down the road, hopefully in person.